The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly beyond the crumbling stone walls, but Maylene's focus was on the eviction notice crumpled in her trembling hand. 6 months pregnant, $47 in her bank account, and now this, a house her estranged grandmother left her that looked ready to collapse at any moment. The roof leaked, the windows were boarded up, and the foundation stones were older than anyone could remember. But Maylene wasn't just another desperate woman down on her luck. She was a former geological surveyor who'd walked away from mining companies and their dirty money years ago. When she noticed the strange metallic glint in the basement's cracked foundation, her trained eye caught what others would miss. Gold veins, thick as her wrist, snaked through the ancient stone. The discovery should have been her salvation. Instead, it became her nightmare, because the moment she started digging, strange accidents began happening. Her car brakes failed, a tree fell inches from where she'd been standing. Someone was watching, waiting, and they wanted her gone. What Maylene didn't know was that her grandmother hadn't died of natural causes, and this house held secrets worth killing for. She kicked a loose stone across the warped wooden floor, the sound echoing through the empty rooms like a gunshot. The baby kicked in response, as if startled by the noise, and Maylene pressed her palm against her swollen belly. "I know, little one. This wasn't exactly the plan." The plan had been simple enough. Sell whatever pathetic inheritance Grandmother Ruth had left behind, use the money to get back on her feet, maybe find a decent apartment before the baby arrived. The plan hadn't included falling in love with a house that seemed determined to kill her. She'd driven up here 3 days ago, expecting to find some modest mountain cottage that might fetch a few $1,000s from weekend hikers looking for a rustic retreat. Instead, she'd discovered what looked like a medieval fortress that time had forgotten. The stone walls were 2 feet thick, built with a craftsmanship that predated modern construction by decades, maybe centuries. The first night, she'd slept in her car rather than trust the sagging stairs to the upper floor. But curiosity had always been her weakness, the same trait that had made her excellent at geological surveys and terrible at following her ex-husband's demands to just let the mining companies handle the technical stuff. When she'd finally worked up the courage to explore the basement, flashlight beam dancing across the ancient stonework, she'd nearly dismissed the metallic gleam as pyrite. Fool's gold. But her fingers had traced the familiar patterns, and her breath had caught in her throat. These weren't surface deposits. This was a substantial gold vein running deep into the mountain itself. The implications had hit her like a physical blow. Her grandmother's house wasn't just built on valuable land. It was built directly over what could be a significant gold mine, the kind of discovery that could set her up for life, provide for her child's future, maybe even fund the environmental geology research she dreamed of pursuing. That same night, driving back to town for supplies, her brake pedal had gone straight to the floor on a mountain curve. Only luck and a conveniently placed guardrail had kept her from plunging into the ravine below. The mechanic had whistled low when he'd seen the brake lines, neatly severed as if by a sharp blade. "Mighty strange," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "Mighty strange indeed." Now, standing in the musty basement again, Maylene ran her fingers along the gold veins that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. She'd spent enough time around mining operations to recognize when something didn't add up. This wasn't some recent discovery. Someone had known about this gold for a long time. The basement walls showed signs of careful excavation, though the work looked old, decades old, maybe more. Someone had been mining here systematically but quietly, very quietly. And when she'd examined the house's foundation more carefully, she'd realized the strange architectural choices weren't random. They were designed to conceal entrances to what appeared to be an extensive tunnel system. Her grandmother had been sitting on a secret gold mine her entire life. But why hadn't Ruth ever mentioned it? Why live in near poverty, accepting charity from the church when she had a fortune literally beneath her feet? The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Maylene felt a familiar surge of fierce protectiveness. Whatever game was being played here, whatever secrets were buried in these mountains, she needed to understand them. Because someone clearly believed this gold was worth killing for, and they weren't going to stop just because she was pregnant. She pulled out her cell phone, grateful for the single bar of service that flickered intermittently in the basement. There was only one person who might have answers about her grandmother's past, her great-aunt Clara, Ruth's younger sister, who'd moved to Florida decades ago and never looked back. As the phone rang, Maylene heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps directly above her head. The rusted key turned with surprising ease, as if the old lock had been waiting decades for this moment. Maylene pushed against the heavy wooden door, and it groaned open, releasing a rush of stale air that carried the scent of abandonment, dust, decay, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Something metallic and cold. She stepped across the threshold, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Weak sunlight filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across a room that time had forgotten. The furniture stood draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and cobwebs hung in delicate curtains from the exposed wooden beams above. "Hello, Great-Aunt Cordelia," she whispered to the silence, though she'd never met the woman who had left her this inheritance. The lawyer had explained that Cordelia Hartwell had been a recluse, living alone in this remote house for over 40 years until her death 3 months ago. Why she'd chosen to leave everything to a great niece she'd never contacted remained a mystery that had died with her. Maylene pulled the sheet from the nearest piece of furniture, revealing an antique writing desk carved from dark wood. A layer of dust puffed into the air, making her cough. She moved methodically through the room, uncovering chairs, a bookshelf lined with leather-bound volumes, and an ornate mirror that reflected her pale face and anxious brown eyes. In the kitchen, she found remnants of her great-aunt's solitary life, a single plate and cup in the sink, a pantry still stocked with canned goods, and a calendar on the wall still turned to February, the month Cordelia had died. Maylene touched her belly again, feeling the baby's gentle movement. At 6 months pregnant and recently widowed, she needed this place to work out. The insurance money from David's accident would only stretch so far, and the idea of raising a child alone in the city terrified her more than this isolated house ever could. She climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, each step creaking ominously under her weight. The bedrooms were as frozen in time as the rest of the house, but it was the master bedroom that caught her attention. Unlike the other rooms, this one felt lived in, as if Cordelia had spent her final days here. The bed was unmade, personal items still scattered on the nightstand, and the window faced east toward a view that made Maylene's breath catch. Beyond the overgrown garden, the land sloped down into a small valley before rising again into densely forested hills. But it wasn't the scenic beauty that struck her, it was the sense of isolation. No other houses were visible in any direction. No power lines or telephone poles broke the horizon. She truly was alone out here. As she turned from the window, her foot caught on something protruding from beneath the bed. Kneeling carefully, she pulled out a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. The brass clasps were tarnished but functional, and inside she found what appeared to be Cordelia's private papers. Letters, photographs, and documents filled the box, but it was the hand-drawn map that made her heart race. The sketch showed the house and surrounding property, but beneath the house's outline, someone had drawn a series of tunnels and chambers. In shaky handwriting, notes were scattered across the paper, main shaft sealed 1952, lower chambers flooded, and most intriguingly, samples tested positive. Assay office confirmed. Maylene sank onto the edge of the bed, studying the map more carefully. If she was reading it correctly, there appeared to be some kind of mine beneath the house. The idea seemed impossible. She was in rural Virginia, not the gold country of California or Alaska. But as she examined the other papers in the box, a picture began to emerge. Cordelia's father had been a mining engineer. Several documents from the 1940s and 1950s mentioned geological surveys and mineral rights. There were assay reports that made Maylene's pulse quicken. They detailed significant gold deposits in sample site a -7, which according to the map corresponded to an area directly beneath where she now sat. A sudden sound from downstairs made her freeze. It was subtle, a creak that didn't match the house's normal settling sounds. She held her breath, listening, but heard only silence. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over her like a cold shadow. Moving quietly to the bedroom window, she peered down at the overgrown yard below. Nothing moved except the wind through the tall grass. But as she turned away, she could have sworn she saw a flash of movement at the tree line. There 1 second, gone the next. Maylene clutched the map tighter, her mind racing. If there really was gold beneath this house, it could change everything. She could provide for her baby, secure their future, maybe even restore this place to something beautiful. But as another unexplained sound drifted up from below, she couldn't shake the feeling that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard as Maylene stood before the weathered front door, keys trembling in her hand. The house looked even more imposing in daylight, 3 stories of grey stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. Ivy crawled up the walls like gnarled fingers, and several shutters hung askew from their hinges. She pressed her free hand to her rounded belly, feeling the baby's gentle movement. "Well, little one, this is our inheritance," she whispered. The baby responded with a soft kick, as if eager to explore their mysterious new home. The key turned with surprising ease, and the heavy door swung open with a prolonged creak that echoed through the empty interior. Stale air rushed out, carrying scents of dust, old wood, and something else, something earthy and metallic that made her nose wrinkle. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight, streaming through grimy windows. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and exposed wooden beams crossing the ceiling. Furniture sat beneath white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and her footsteps echoed hollowly on the wide planked floors. Maylene pulled out the letter from Great-Aunt Cordelia's lawyer and read it again. "The house has been in our family for over a century," she murmured, running her fingers along a carved wooden banister. "Why did no one ever mention it?" She climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step. The second floor held 4 bedrooms, each with tall windows that would flood the rooms with light once cleaned. In what must have been the master bedroom, she found a trunk at the foot of an enormous 4-poster bed. The trunk wasn't locked. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, she discovered photograph albums, letters tied with ribbon, and a leather-bound journal. She opened the journal carefully, squinting at the faded ink. "Property of Cordelia Blackwood, 1952, she read aloud. The entries were sparse at first, notes about household expenses and weather observations, but as she flipped through the pages, the tone changed dramatically. The sounds from below grow stronger each night. Samuel insists it's merely the old house settling, but I know better. Something stirs beneath us, something that should remain undisturbed." Maylene's pulse quickened. She turned the page. "Found the entrance today, hidden behind the pantry wall. The passage is older than the house itself, carved directly into the bedrock. Samuel forbade me from exploring further, but how can I resist? The family stories may not be mere legend after all." A sudden crash from downstairs made Maylene jump. The journal tumbled from her hands as she listened intently. Silence stretched for several heartbeats before she heard it again. Deliberate footsteps moving across the main floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Maylene grabbed the journal and crept toward the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered down into the main room but saw nothing out of place. The front door remained closed, just as she'd left it. Must have been something falling, she told herself, but her hands shook as she descended the stairs. In the kitchen, she found the source of the noise. A cast-iron pot had fallen from its hook above the ancient stove, leaving a dent in the wooden floor. But there was no wind, no vibration that might have caused it to fall. She bent to retrieve it, noticing how the metal was surprisingly warm to the touch. It was then she spotted the gap in the pantry wall that Cordelia had written about. What she'd initially taken for a shadow was actually an opening, roughly 3 feet high and partially concealed by a wooden panel that had swung aside. Maylene knelt carefully, accommodating her pregnancy, and peered into the darkness beyond. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying that same earthy metallic scent she'd noticed when she first entered the house. She pulled out her phone and activated its flashlight. The beam revealed roughly hewn stone walls and what appeared to be the beginning of a descending passage. Strange symbols were carved into the rock face, not random scratches but deliberate markings that seemed to follow some ancient pattern. A sound echoed from deep within the passage, like distant water dripping or footsteps. Maylene's blood turned to ice as she realized the sound was growing closer. She scrambled backward, bumping into the kitchen counter. The flashlight beam wavered wildly before she managed to steady it, but the passage now appeared empty. Yet the metallic scent had grown stronger, almost overwhelming. Maylene slammed the wooden panel back into place and backed away from the pantry, clutching Cordelia's journal to her chest. Whatever lay beneath the house, whatever had prompted those cryptic journal entries, she wasn't prepared to face it alone. But as she turned to leave, she could swear she heard something moving behind the panel, something that knew she'd found the entrance and was very much aware of her presence. The morning light filtered through dusty windows as Maylene descended the basement stairs, her flashlight beam dancing across the stone walls. Sleep had eluded her after yesterday's discovery, her mind churning with questions about the hidden passage and what it might contain. The baby stirred restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her excitement. She'd spent the night researching the Blackwood family history online, finding scattered references to mining operations in the area during the 1800s. Most records were frustratingly vague, but one newspaper clipping from 1887 mentioned a tragic collapse at the Blackwood claim that killed 3 men. After that, the mine had apparently been sealed and forgotten. The loose stone she'd discovered yesterday came away easily now, revealing the narrow passage beyond. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying with it the scent of earth and something metallic. Maylene squeezed through the gap, her pregnant belly making the passage uncomfortably tight. The tunnel stretched ahead, carved roughly from bedrock and shored up with rotting timbers. Her flashlight revealed old tool marks on the walls and the remnants of wooden support beams that had seen better decades. She moved carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. After 20 yards, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Maylene's breath caught as her light swept across the space. Mining equipment from another era lay scattered about, rusted pickaxes, overturned ore carts, and coils of rope that crumbled at a touch. But it was the walls that made her heart race. Veins of gold gleamed in the flashlight beam, threading through the rock like frozen lightning. Some of the ore had been extracted, leaving behind cavities where miners had followed the precious metal deeper into the earth. But vast amounts remained, untouched for over a century. "My God," she whispered, running her fingers along a particularly rich vein. The gold was real, substantial enough to solve every financial worry she'd ever had. This wasn't just a decrepit house she'd inherited, it was a treasure trove. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the mine, causing her to freeze. It was soft, like fabric brushing against stone, but distinct enough to raise the hair on her arms. She wasn't alone down here. "Hello?" she called out, immediately regretting it. If someone else knew about the mine, someone who'd been keeping its existence secret, they might not appreciate her presence. The sound came again, closer now. Maylene backed toward the passage, but her retreat was cut short by a man's voice, low and urgent. "You shouldn't be here." A figure emerged from a side tunnel she hadn't noticed, and Maylene's flashlight illuminated a face she didn't recognize. He was perhaps 60, weathered and lean, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance. "Who are you?" she managed, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "Name's Garrett Reeves. I've been keeping watch over this place for longer than you've been alive." He gestured toward the gold-veined walls. "Your great-aunt knew I was here. We had an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" Garrett's expression darkened, the kind that kept certain people from asking questions about what happened down here, questions that got 3 good men killed in 1887 and could get more people killed today. Maylene felt the baby kick, as if reacting to her spiking anxiety. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm warning you. This mine isn't just valuable because of the gold. It's dangerous because of what else is buried down here." He paused, studying her face in the harsh flashlight glow. "Your great-aunt never told you about the real reason the mine was sealed, did she?" "She died when I was 12. We barely spoke about anything, let alone mining." Garrett nodded grimly. "Then you don't know about the partners, about what they found alongside the gold, or about why one of them murdered the other 3 to keep it secret." The chamber suddenly felt smaller, the weight of rock and earth above pressing down on Maylene's shoulders. "What are you talking about? There are chambers deeper in the mine that haven't been opened since 1887. Your great-aunt made sure of that, just like her father did, and his father before him. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." A new sound echoed through the tunnels, footsteps coming from the direction of the house. Garrett's face went pale. "Someone else is here," he whispered urgently. "Someone who shouldn't know about this place." Maylene heard voices now, muffled but getting closer. 2 men, maybe 3, speaking in low tones as they searched the basement above. "Is there another way out?" she whispered. Garrett nodded toward the deeper tunnels. "But if we go that way, there's no turning back. Once you see what's down there, you'll understand why people have killed to protect these secrets." The footsteps above grew louder, accompanied by the sound of stones being moved. They'd found the passage. The rain drummed against the warped window frames as Maylene spread the yellowed documents across the kitchen table. The electricity had flickered twice in the past hour, and she'd lit several candles to supplement the weak overhead bulb. Each page she examined felt fragile beneath her fingers, threatening to crumble at the slightest pressure. The birth certificate she'd found was dated 1892, bearing the name Eleanor Blackwood, the same surname etched on the weathered headstone she'd discovered behind the house. But it was the handwritten letter tucked beneath it that made her breath catch. "My dearest daughter," it began in careful script, "if you are reading this, then the worst has come to pass. The mine must be sealed forever. What we found in those depths was never meant for this world." Maylene's hand instinctively moved to her growing belly. The baby kicked, as if sensing her unease. She continued reading, squinting in the candlelight. "3 men have died already. Samuel fell first," said the walls were whispering to him before he walked straight into that dark pool. "Then came Marcus, found at the bottom of the main shaft with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The others are talking of leaving, but Thomas insists we can still extract the remaining gold safely." The letter's edge was stained with something dark, ink or perhaps something worse. Maylene turned the page carefully. "The indigenous people warned us before we began digging. They spoke of something sleeping beneath the mountain, something that fed on greed and blood. We should have listened. Instead, we pushed deeper, drawn by the promise of wealth beyond imagination. Now I fear we've awakened something that should have remained buried." A sudden bang from upstairs made Maylene jump. She sat perfectly still, listening. The house often made strange noises, settling foundations, wind through broken boards, but this had sounded deliberate, heavy, like footsteps. She gathered the documents quickly and tucked them into her jacket pocket. The candle flames danced as she moved, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Another sound echoed from above, definitely footsteps this time, slow and measured. Maylene grabbed the largest kitchen knife from the counter and crept toward the staircase. Each step groaned under her weight as she climbed, the knife trembling in her grip. The footsteps had stopped, but she could hear something else now, a low humming, almost like a lullaby. The upstairs hallway stretched before her, darker than usual despite the candle she'd left burning. 3 doors led off the main corridor, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The humming seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" she called softly, immediately regretting the decision. If someone had broken in, announcing her presence was foolish, but the alternative, that something else entirely was in her house, seemed far worse. The humming stopped abruptly. Maylene approached the first bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open with the knife's tip, peering into the empty space. Moonlight filtered through torn curtains, illuminating dust motes that swirled without any breeze to stir them. A creak came from behind her. She spun around to find the bathroom door, which she was certain had been closed, now standing wide open. Inside, the old clawfoot tub was filled with dark water that definitely hadn't been there an hour ago. The metallic smell of rust or blood drifted into the hallway. Maylene backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if responding to her panic. She needed to get out of the house, needed to call someone, but her cell phone sat charging in the kitchen below. As she turned toward the stairs, a figure stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the hallway. It was a woman, in a long, tattered dress that might once have been white. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her skin had the pale, waxy appearance of something that had been underwater too long. But it was her eyes that made Maylene's blood freeze. They glowed with the same unnatural golden light she'd seen in the mine. "Shouldn't have come here," the woman whispered, her voice carrying the sound of distant water dripping in caves. "The mine calls to those with Blackwood blood, but the price is always the same." Maylene gripped the knife tighter, though she doubted it would be much use against whatever stood before her. "What do you want?" "To warn you, as I tried to warn the others. The gold corrupts everything it touches. It whispers promises of wealth and security, especially to those who carry new life." The woman's gaze dropped to Maylene's belly. "But it demands payment in return. It always has." The lights flickered once more and went out completely, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness. When Maylene struck a match from her pocket, the woman had vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of stagnant water and something else, something that reminded her uncomfortably of the musty air she'd breathed in the mine's depths. The flashlight beam danced across the tunnel walls as Maylene descended deeper into the earth, her free hand trailing along the rough stone for balance. Each step echoed in the darkness ahead, swallowed by shadows that seemed to press closer with every breath. The air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of minerals and something else, something organic and unsettling. Her pregnancy made the descent more challenging than she'd anticipated. The baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing her unease, and she paused frequently to catch her breath. The wooden support beams that lined the tunnel looked ancient, their surfaces darkened with age and moisture. Some showed signs of newer repairs, crude patches and reinforcements that suggested someone had been maintaining this passage recently. The tunnel curved sharply to the right, and Maylene found herself in a wider chamber. Her flashlight revealed pickaxe marks scarring the walls, and the floor was littered with chunks of quartz that glittered like fallen stars in the artificial light. This had definitely been a working mine, probably dating back to the gold rush era when half of Colorado had been torn apart by prospectors chasing their fortunes. A sound made her freeze, a distant scraping like metal against stone. She clicked off the flashlight and stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. The darkness pressed against her like a living thing, and for several terrifying moments, she wondered if she'd made a catastrophic mistake coming down here alone. The sound didn't repeat. After counting to 60, she switched the light back on and continued forward, moving more cautiously now. The chamber narrowed again into another tunnel, this one sloping downward at a steeper angle. The walls here showed different tool marks, newer ones made by modern equipment. Someone had definitely been expanding or renovating these passages. The tunnel opened into what could only be described as an underground workshop. Maylene's breath caught as her flashlight swept across the space. Modern mining equipment sat alongside antique tools. Battery-powered lamps hung from hooks driven into the stone walls. A wooden table held maps, notebooks, and what looked like geological surveys. Most shocking of all, a generator hummed quietly in one corner, its red power light glowing like a malevolent eye. Someone, was actively working this mine. Maylene approached the table with trembling hands. The maps showed the layout of the tunnels in meticulous detail, far more extensive than what she'd explored. Red X marks indicated specific locations, with dates and notations written in a cramped handwriting she didn't recognize. The most recent entries were from just 3 days ago. One of the notebooks lay open, its pages filled with calculations and sketches of rock formations. The handwriting was definitely masculine, sharp and angular. As she read, her blood grew cold. The entries detailed not just mining operations, but surveillance notes about the house above, notes about her. Subject arrived Tuesday. Pregnant, appears to be alone. Vehicle, blue Honda Civic, Colorado plates. Has been exploring the house but hasn't found the entrance yet. The entry was dated the day after she'd arrived. Her hands shook as she flipped through more pages. Whoever had written this had been watching her every move, documenting her routines, even speculating about how long she might stay. The final entry made her stomach lurch. Subject getting too close. May need to accelerate timeline. Consider direct intervention if she discovers the lower levels. A new sound echoed through the tunnels. Footsteps, deliberate and getting closer. Maylene clicked off the flashlight and crouched behind the generator, her mind racing. Someone was coming, and from the measured pace of the footsteps, they knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps paused at the chamber entrance. A powerful LED flashlight blazed to life, sweeping the room in a systematic search pattern. Maylene pressed herself lower behind the generator, trying to control her breathing, trying to keep the baby from moving and giving her away. "I know you're down here," a man's voice called out, gravelly and tired. Saw the light from the upper tunnel. No point hiding. The beam moved closer to her hiding spot. In seconds, it would find her. "Look, lady, I'm not going to hurt you," the voice continued, though something in its tone suggested otherwise. "I just need to talk to you about what you've seen down here, about what you think you know." Maylene's hand closed around a chunk of loose quartz the size of her fist. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. The footsteps resumed, moving directly toward the generator now. The light beam swept left, then right, then... There you are. The light blazed directly into her eyes, blinding her. She couldn't see the man behind it, could only make out a dark silhouette. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like work clothes. "Now then," he said, his voice carrying an edge of menace despite his earlier reassurances. "We need to have ourselves a little conversation about property rights and family obligations, about debts that need paying and secrets that need keeping." He took a step closer, "Starting with what you're going to do to help me finish what your great-aunt started." The musty basement air felt thick against Maylene's skin as she descended the wooden stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The flashlight beam danced across stone walls that seemed to absorb the light, revealing patches of moisture and something that looked disturbingly like old bloodstains. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly as the baby kicked, as if sensing her unease. 3 days had passed since she'd found the mine entrance, and despite Marcus's warnings about structural integrity, she couldn't shake the feeling that answers lay hidden in the darkness below. The basement stretched farther than she'd initially realized, with alcoves carved into the rock that housed remnants of mining equipment, rusted pickaxes, rotted wooden buckets, and coils of rope that crumbled at her touch. But it was the newer items scattered among the antiques that made her pulse quicken. Fresh cigarette butts, a plastic water bottle dated from last year, and muddy boot prints that definitely weren't hers. Someone had been down here recently, very recently. The sound of footsteps above made her freeze, heavy boots crossing the kitchen floor, too deliberate to be casual. She clicked off the flashlight and pressed herself against the cold stone wall, listening as the footsteps paused directly over her head. The basement door creaked open. "I know you're down there, Maylene." The voice belonged to Sheriff Garrett, but his usual friendly tone had vanished, replaced by something flat and dangerous. "We need to have a conversation." Her throat went dry. There was no other way out, she'd checked. The mine entrance was sealed and the basement stairs were the only exit. She was trapped. "I'm coming up," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. The baby shifted restlessly as she climbed the stairs, her legs feeling unsteady. Garrett stood in her kitchen, hat in his hands, but his stance was anything but casual. Behind him lurked Deputy Morrison, younger and nervous, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Heard you've been asking questions around town," Garrett said, settling into one of her chairs without invitation. "About the Blackwood family. About what happened in that mine. It's my property now. I have a right to know its history." History. Garrett's laugh held no humor. That's one way to put it. Another way would be to call it ancient history that's better left buried. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, maybe we should—" "Should what, Morrison? Let her stumble around down there until she finds something she shouldn't." Garrett's eyes never left Maylene's face. "My grandfather worked that mine, girl. So did his father before him. 3 generations of Garretts have kept certain secrets, and I'll be damned if I let some outsider ruin everything now." The pieces began clicking into place. "You knew about the gold." "Of course I knew. Half the town knows or suspects, but knowing and acting on it are 2 different things entirely." He leaned forward and she caught a whiff of alcohol on his breath despite the early hour. "That mine claimed 12 lives in 1943. 12 good men who died because someone got greedy. The cave-in wasn't an accident." Garrett's silence was answer enough. "Who?" she pressed. "Who killed them?" "Dead men tell no tales, as they say. But their families, their descendants, they remember. They remember the debts owed and the prices that were paid." His voice dropped lower. "Some debts run deeper than gold, Maylene. Some secrets are worth killing for." The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her surge of adrenaline. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm warning you. There's a difference." He stood, Morrison following suit. "You seem like a nice girl. Decent, about to be a mother. It would be a shame if something happened to you. Like what happened to the previous owner. Eleanor Blackwood didn't die of natural causes, did she?" Morrison's face went pale, but Garrett's expression remained stone. Eleanor was 93 years old. Heart failure's common at that age, especially when someone helps it along. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Garrett replaced his hat with deliberate slowness. "You're walking a dangerous path, girl. I've been patient because you're new here, because you're carrying a child. But my patience has limits." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Sell the house. Take whatever money you can get and leave Millbrook. There's nothing here for you but trouble. And if I don't?" His smile was colder than the mountain wind. "Then you might find yourself having an accident. These old houses can be treacherous, especially for pregnant women. Stairs are slippery, gas leaks happen. Sometimes people just disappear." After they left, Maylene double-locked the door and slumped against it, her heart hammering. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly as she tried to process what had just happened. She was completely alone, carrying a child, sitting on top of a fortune that people had already killed for. And now she knew that the very people sworn to protect her were the ones she needed to fear most. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the stone house as Maylene carefully descended into the mine shaft, her flashlight cutting through the darkness below. The rope ladder swayed slightly under her weight, and she moved slowly, acutely aware of the precious cargo she carried. Each rung brought her deeper into the earth, farther from safety, but closer to answers she desperately needed. The tunnel system was more extensive than she'd initially realized. What had seemed like a simple shaft from above opened into a network of passages that branched off in multiple directions. The air was stale but breathable, suggesting ventilation somewhere in the system. Her footsteps echoed off the stone walls, each sound amplified in the confined space. Following the main passage, she discovered tool marks in the walls, evidence of methodical excavation. This wasn't some hastily dug hideout. It was a sophisticated mining operation that must have taken years to complete. The precision of the work suggested professional miners, not desperate treasure hunters. A glint caught her eye, and she knelt carefully, running her fingers along a section of wall where gold veins snaked through the rock like frozen lightning. The deposits were rich, far richer than anything she'd read about in the local geological surveys. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this discovery secret. Deeper in the tunnel, she found the first chamber. It was larger than she'd expected, with timber supports that looked relatively recent. In one corner sat wooden crates, their surfaces covered with decades of dust. Her heart raced as she approached them, the beam of her flashlight revealing stenciled markings on the sides, dates from the 1960s. The first crate she opened contained mining equipment, pickaxes, shovels, and several items she didn't recognize. But the second crate made her breath catch. Stacks of gold bars, each one stamped with crude markings, filled the container. There was more wealth in this single box than most people saw in a lifetime. A noise from somewhere in the tunnel system made her freeze. It was distant but distinct, the sound of footsteps on stone. Someone else was down here. Maylene quickly closed the crate and switched off her flashlight, plunging herself into complete darkness. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the bobbing light of another flashlight. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to control her breathing. The baby shifted inside her, as if sensing her fear. Through the darkness, she could hear voices now. Two men, their conversation echoing through the tunnels. "She's been down here," one voice said, gruff and unfamiliar. "Look at these footprints in the dust." "Find her," replied another voice, one that sent ice through her veins. She recognized it now. It was Marcus, the real estate agent who'd been so eager to help her with the property transfer. She's seen too much already. Maylene realized with growing horror that she was trapped. The voices were coming from the direction of the main tunnel, blocking her path back to the rope ladder. She needed another way out, and she needed it quickly. Moving as quietly as possible in the darkness, she felt her way along the chamber wall until she found another opening, a smaller passage that led deeper into the earth. She had no choice but to follow it and hope it connected to another exit. The narrow tunnel forced her to crouch as she moved, her hand trailing along the wall for guidance. Behind her, the voices grew louder as the men discovered the chamber. Their flashlight beams danced across the walls, searching. "The crates have been disturbed," Marcus's voice carried through the stone. "She knows about the gold." The passage began to slope upward, giving Maylene hope that it might lead to the surface. Her legs ached from the awkward crouching position, and her back protested with each step. But the fear of being caught drove her forward. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she saw something that made her heart leap, a faint glimmer of natural light ahead. The passage was widening, and the air was definitely fresher. She emerged into another chamber, this one with a natural opening that led to a concealed entrance behind a cluster of boulders on the hillside above her house. From this vantage point, she could see her property below, and more importantly, a black SUV parked beside her own car. She recognized it as the vehicle Marcus had been driving during their property meetings. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Her inheritance wasn't the lucky break she'd thought it was. Someone had been using the old mine for decades, and her arrival threatened their operation. The convenient death of her great-aunt, the eager real estate agent, the rush to transfer the property, none of it had been coincidence. As she watched, two figures emerged from her house, clearly having searched it in her absence. One was Marcus, but she couldn't identify the other man from this distance. They were looking for her, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. Maylene knew she couldn't go back to the house. She needed help, but who could she trust when she didn't know how deep this conspiracy went? The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the stone house, casting long shadows across the floor where Maylene sat hunched over her laptop. Her back ached from sleeping on the lumpy couch, but she'd been too afraid to venture upstairs after yesterday's encounter with the intruder. Every creak of the old house made her jump, her hand instinctively moving to protect her growing belly. She'd spent the night researching everything she could find about the Blackwood family and their connection to this property. The internet had yielded fragments, Newspaper clippings from the 1920s about mining accidents, property records that seemed deliberately obscured, and most disturbing of all, a series of missing person reports spanning decades, all involving people who had shown interest in purchasing or exploring the land. A knock at the front door made her heart leap into her throat. Through the window she could see Sheriff Daniels standing on the porch, his expression grim. Beside him stood a woman she didn't recognize, tall, sharp-featured, wearing an expensive coat that seemed out of place in this rural setting. "Mrs. Harper?" Daniels called through the door. "We need to speak with you." Maylene reluctantly opened the door, keeping the chain latch engaged. "What's this about?" "This is Victoria Blackwood," Daniels said, nodding toward the woman. "She represents certain family interests regarding this property. May we come in?" The name hit Maylene like a physical blow. Blackwood. She studied the woman's face, noting the predatory gleam in her dark eyes. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." Victoria stepped forward, her voice smooth as silk. "Mrs. Harper, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about what you've inherited. My family has legitimate claims to certain assets on this property. I'm here to resolve this matter amicably." "Assets?" Maylene's grip tightened on the door. "You mean the gold mine?" The woman's composure cracked for just a moment, surprise flickering across her features. "So you know, that simplifies things considerably." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope. "I'm prepared to offer you a very generous sum for the property, enough to set you and your child up for life, somewhere far more suitable for raising a family." "The mine doesn't belong to you," Maylene said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I've seen the deed. My great-aunt left everything to me." Victoria's smile turned cold. "Deeds can be complicated things, Mrs. Harper, especially when they involve properties with such a complex history. I'm sure you wouldn't want to get tangled up in lengthy legal proceedings, especially in your condition." Sheriff Daniels shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Mrs. Harper, I'd strongly advise you to consider Miss Blackwood's offer. This area has seen some unfortunate incidents over the years, people who've gotten in over their heads." The threat was barely veiled, and Maylene felt a chill run down her spine. These weren't just greedy relatives trying to claim an inheritance. This was something much more dangerous. "I need time to think about it." "Of course," Victoria said, though her eyes remained hard. "But don't take too long. My patience isn't unlimited, and there are others who might not be as diplomatic in their approach." After they left, Maylene double-checked all the locks and returned to her research with renewed urgency. She needed to understand what she was really dealing with. The gold mine was clearly valuable enough that people were willing to kill for it, but there had to be more to the story. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging or join the others who couldn't leave well enough alone." Maylene's hands shook as she read the message. The others? Was that what had happened to all those missing people? Her great-aunt Cordelia must have known about the danger. Why else would she have been so secretive, so paranoid in her final years? She needed help, but who could she trust? Sheriff Daniels was clearly compromised, and she was completely alone in this isolated place. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and her own family lived across the country. Then she remembered something. Among her great-aunt's papers, there had been a business card for a geological surveyor named Marcus Chen. The card was old, but maybe he was still around. Maybe he knew something about what lay beneath the house. As she searched through the box of documents, she heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps that didn't belong to either Daniels or Victoria Blackwood. Maylene grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and crept toward the window. A man in work clothes was examining the foundation of the house, taking photographs with a professional-looking camera. When he looked up toward the window, she ducked back, but not before catching sight of his face, scarred, weathered, with eyes that held the same predatory gleam she'd seen in Victoria Blackwood's gaze. Whatever secrets lay buried beneath this house, Maylene realized she was running out of time to uncover them before someone decided she knew too much to live. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown garden, as Maylene made her way to the tool shed behind the stone house. Her back ached with each step, the baby seeming heavier with each passing day. She'd barely slept after finding the threatening note, her mind racing through possibilities of who might know about the mine. Inside the shed, she pushed aside rusted gardening tools and moth-eaten canvas tops until she found what she was looking for. A metal detector her great-aunt had apparently used for treasure hunting. The irony wasn't lost on her that Aunt Cordelia had owned such a device while sitting on an actual gold mine. As she struggled to lift the heavy equipment, a voice behind her made her jump. "Need some help with that?" Maylene spun around to find Jake Martinez, the local sheriff, standing in the doorway. His tall frame blocked most of the sunlight, casting his face in shadow. "Jake, you scared me half to death." She pressed a hand to her racing heart. "Sorry about that. I was driving by and saw the shed door open. Thought I'd check on you." He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the cluttered space. "What's got you digging around out here?" Maylene hesitated. Could she trust him with the truth about the mine? The threatening note had made it clear that someone dangerous was watching her every move, but Jake had always been kind to her, and she desperately needed an ally. "I've been finding some unusual things around the property," she said carefully. "Old tools, strange markings. I thought maybe the metal detector might help me understand what Aunt Cordelia was up to before she died." Jake nodded, though something flickered in his expression. Cordelia was quite the character. Always claimed this land held secrets. He reached for the metal detector. "Here, let me get that for you." As they walked back toward the house, Jake seemed unusually quiet. Maylene glanced at him sideways, noting the tension in his jaw. "Is everything all right? You seem distracted." "Actually, there is something I need to tell you." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I've been doing some research into your aunt's death. The more I dig, the more questions I have." Maylene's blood went cold. "What kind of questions?" "The coroner ruled it an accident. Said she fell down those basement stairs. But I found something odd in her medical records. She had excellent balance, no history of falls or dizzy spells. In fact, her doctor's notes from just a week before her death mention how remarkably steady she was for her age." The basement stairs. Maylene thought of her own near miss just days ago, how the railing had given way so easily. You think she was murdered?" "I think it's possible." Jake's voice was grim. "And if that's true, then whoever killed her might not be happy about you inheriting this place." A chill ran down Maylene's spine as she remembered the note. "Leave now or join your aunt." She was about to tell Jake about it when the sound of tires on gravel interrupted them. A black sedan was pulling up the long driveway. "Expecting company?" Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his service weapon. Maylene watched as two men in expensive suits emerged from the car. Even from a distance, she could see they weren't locals. They moved with the confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. The older of the two men approached them with a practiced smile. "Miss Harper, I'm Richard Blackwood from Meridian Development Corp. This is my associate, Mr. Chen. We'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Maylene felt Jake tense beside her. "What kind of business?" "We're interested in purchasing your property," Blackwood continued smoothly. "We're prepared to make a very generous offer, well above market value. You could be somewhere safer, more suitable for your condition within the week." The emphasis on safer wasn't lost on Maylene. Was this a threat disguised as an offer? "I'm not interested in selling." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "Perhaps you should reconsider. This old place is quite isolated, and with a baby coming. Well, accidents can happen so easily." Jake stepped forward, his badge clearly visible. "I think you gentlemen should leave. Miss Harper has made her position clear." Chen spoke for the first time, his voice flat and menacing. "Sheriff Martinez, isn't it? I'd be careful about getting too involved in matters that don't concern you." "The offer stands," Blackwood said, pulling a business card from his jacket, "but it won't stand forever. Some opportunities have expiration dates." As the sedan pulled away, Maylene turned to Jake with fear evident in her eyes.
They know about the mine. They have to.
Jake frowned. What mine? Looking into his confused face, Maylene made a decision that would change everything. There's something I need to show you. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made Maylene's blood freeze. She pressed herself against the kitchen window, peering through the gap in the curtains as headlights swept across the overgrown yard. The black sedan that had been following her earlier now sat in her driveway like a predator claiming its territory. Two men emerged from the vehicle, their movements deliberate and unhurried. The taller one wore a expensive-looking coat despite the warm evening, while his companion carried what appeared to be a leather briefcase. They weren't here for a social visit. Maylene's hand instinctively moved to her belly as the baby kicked, as if sensing her fear. She had to think fast. The journal and maps were spread across the kitchen table, evidence of everything she'd discovered about the mine. If these men were connected to whoever had been watching the property, those documents could get her killed. The doorbell rang, its ancient chime echoing through the house like a death knell. She swept the papers into a flour canister, her hands shaking as she tried to make the kitchen look normal. The bell rang again, followed by firm knocking that seemed to shake the old wooden door. "Mrs. Morrison?" The voice was smooth, cultured. "We'd like to speak with you about your recent inheritance." Maylene crept to the front hall, staying out of sight of the windows. "I don't know who you are. Please leave." "I'm afraid we can't do that." The doorknob rattled. "We represent certain interests regarding this property, interests that predate your claim to it." Through the peephole, she could see the man's face, angular features, cold eyes that seemed to look right through the door. His companion was examining the lock with tools she recognized from crime shows. "You're breaking into my house," she called out, backing toward the kitchen. "I'm calling the police." A low chuckle carried through the door. "By all means. Though I should mention that Sheriff Davidson is currently dealing with a rather urgent matter on the other side of the county. Something about a warehouse fire. Terrible timing." The lock clicked open. Maylene's heart hammered as she realized they'd orchestrated this perfectly. She grabbed her phone and the car keys, then remembered the hidden passage Marcus had shown her. The entrance was in the basement, behind the furnace. If she could reach it before they found her... The front door creaked open just as she slipped through the basement door. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, each sound seeming to echo like gunshots in the darkness. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the main floor and voices discussing where to search first. The basement smelled of damp earth and rust. She felt her way past the furnace to the concealed panel, her fingers fumbling with the hidden latch. The passage opened with a grinding sound that made her wince. "Check the basement," came the voice from above. She squeezed through the opening, pulling the panel closed behind her, just as light spilled down the basement stairs. The tunnel stretched ahead into absolute darkness, but she didn't dare use her phone's flashlight yet. Instead, she felt her way along the rough stone walls, each step taking her deeper into the mountain. The air grew colder as she moved away from the house. Behind her, muffled voices indicated they'd found the basement, but hadn't yet discovered the passage. She allowed herself to hope she might escape. When her foot hit something metallic, the clang echoed through the tunnel like a bell. Everything went silent above. Then came the sound of furniture being moved, the furnace door being opened and closed, and finally the unmistakable scrape of the panel sliding open. "Well, well," the cultured voice drifted down the tunnel. "Mrs. Morrison, you've just saved us considerable time. We were wondering how you'd managed to locate the main shaft so quickly." A flashlight beam pierced the darkness behind her. Maylene ran. The tunnel branched ahead, and she chose the left passage purely on instinct. The floor sloped downward, and she could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. Her breathing echoed off the walls, ragged and desperate. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if protesting the jostling. She placed a protective hand over her belly and forced herself to slow down. Falling in here could kill them both. The pursuing footsteps had fallen behind, but she could still see the glow of their flashlights reflecting off the tunnel walls. They knew these passages, probably better than she did. A cool breeze touched her face, carrying the scent of earth and something else. Water, real water, not just the dripping she'd heard before. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, and in the dim light filtering from somewhere above, she could see an underground stream cutting across the floor. But it was what lay beyond the stream that made her gasp. Gold veins ran through the far wall like frozen lightning, more extensive than anything in Samuel's journal. This wasn't just a mine, it was the source of a fortune vast enough to kill for. And standing beside the stream, as if he'd been waiting for her, was Marcus. The musty scent of aged paper and leather filled Maylene's nostrils as she carefully opened the wooden chest they'd hauled up from the mine. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted out the first bundle of documents, their edges yellowed and brittle with age. Marcus held the flashlight steady while she unwrapped the oilcloth protecting the papers. "Property deeds," she whispered, squinting at the faded ink. "Dating back to 1847. And look at this, mining claims, transfer documents, even what looks like a partnership agreement." Marcus leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against hers. "Can you make out the names?" She traced her finger along the cramped handwriting. "Ezra Blackwood, that's my great-great-grandfather. And here, Thomas Caldwell." Her voice caught. "Marcus, that's got to be related to Sheriff Caldwell. Jesus." Marcus sat back on his heels. "So this goes back generations." Maylene continued sorting through the documents, her baby shifting restlessly as she bent forward. Birth certificates, death records, and then something that made her blood run cold, a handwritten confession dated 1892. "Listen to this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I, Thomas Caldwell, do hereby confess to the murder of Ezra Blackwood on the night of September 15th, in the year of our Lord 1892. The deed was done to prevent his exposure of our mining operations and the disposal of undesirable elements who threatened our enterprise." Marcus grabbed her wrist gently. "Disposal of undesirable elements?" "There's more." Maylene's mouth had gone dry. "We have used the abandoned shafts to conceal evidence of our activities, including the remains of those who would not cooperate with our business arrangements. May God forgive us for what we have done in pursuit of gold." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the settling of old wood and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Maylene carefully set the confession aside and reached for another bundle. Inside she found photographs, tintypes showing men in mining gear, but also images that made her stomach lurch. Bodies being lowered into mine shafts, groups of men standing around what appeared to be freshly sealed tunnel entrances. "This isn't just about gold," she whispered. "They were using the mine as a mass grave." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "And Sheriff Caldwell knows about this. That's why he's been so interested in keeping you away from the property. It's not just about protecting some old mining operation. He's protecting his family's reputation. Hell, maybe he's protecting himself from accessory charges if this ever came to light." Maylene struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her lower back. "But why kill James? He was helping them keep this secret." "Maybe he wasn't." Marcus turned back to her. "Maybe he found this chest or something like it and decided he couldn't stay quiet anymore. Think about it. He's been the caretaker here for years. He probably knew more about this place than anyone." A creaking sound from downstairs made them both freeze. Maylene's heart hammered against her ribs as they listened. Heavy footsteps crossed the main floor, deliberate and unhurried. Marcus moved quickly to Maylene's side, gathering the most damning documents. "Back window," he mouthed silently. But before they could move, Sheriff Caldwell's voice echoed up the stairs. "Miss Harper, I know you're up there. Your car's outside and I saw the light. We need to talk." Maylene clutched the confession to her chest. The footsteps began climbing the stairs, each creak marking Caldwell's steady approach. Marcus positioned himself between Maylene and the doorway, but they both knew he was no match for an armed man. "I'm disappointed," Caldwell called out as he reached the landing. I really hoped you'd take my advice and leave well enough alone. He appeared in the doorway, his service weapon drawn but held low at his side. His usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. "Sheriff," Maylene said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "we were just—" "I know what you were doing," his eyes fixed on the papers in her hands. "And I know what you found. The question now is what we're going to do about it." Marcus stepped forward slightly. "Look, Caldwell, this doesn't have to go badly. We can work something out." The sheriff's laugh was bitter. "Work something out? You have documents that could destroy my family's name and potentially expose crimes going back over a century. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, they all knew. They all kept the secret. And now you think we can just work something out?" Maylene felt the baby kick hard, as if responding to her spike of adrenaline. "Those people deserve justice. Their families deserve to know what happened to them." "Those people were claimed jumpers, thieves, and worse," Caldwell snapped. "They got what they deserved." The conviction in his voice chilled her more than any threat could have. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as Maylene descended the narrow stone steps, each footfall echoing in the confined space. Behind her, Detective Morrison's breathing was steady but cautious, his own light sweeping the walls for any sign of movement. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying the metallic scent of old mining equipment and something else, something that made her stomach clench with dread. "How deep does this go?" Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. Maylene counted the steps automatically, a habit she'd developed during her previous explorations. 47 steps to the first landing, she murmured back. Then it branches off into 3 different tunnels. They reached the landing, and Morrison played his light across the branching pathways. The wooden support beams looked ancient but solid, carved with markings that seemed to shimmer in the wavering light. Maylene had studied them before, recognizing some symbols from her grandmother's journals, but others remained mysterious. "Which way?" Morrison asked. Maylene pointed to the middle tunnel. "That leads to the main mining chamber. If Harold's down here, that's where he'd go. It's where the real treasure is." As they moved deeper into the mine, the walls began to change. The rough-hewn stone gave way to something more deliberate, more purposeful. Carved niches held the remnants of old torches, and the floor showed signs of regular use, not just from Maylene's recent visits, but from something more recent. Fresh boot prints in the dust. Morrison noticed them too, crouching to examine the marks. Size 11, maybe 12. Heavy tread. Work boots. He looked up at Maylene. "When were you last down here?" 3 days ago. "These aren't mine." They continued forward, following the trail of footprints. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, and Maylene's flashlight revealed the breathtaking sight that had first amazed her weeks ago. Veins of gold ran through the walls like frozen lightning, and ancient mining tools lay scattered about, as if their owners had simply vanished mid-task. But tonight, something was different. A camping lantern sat on a wooden crate near the far wall, casting harsh shadows across the chamber. Next to it, papers were scattered across an improvised desk, maps, geological surveys, and what looked like legal documents. "He's been living down here," Morrison said, examining the makeshift camp. "Sleeping bag, water bottles, canned food. This is recent. Maybe a day or 2. Maylene picked up one of the papers, her heart racing as she recognized the letterhead. "This is from Hartwell Mining Corporation. It's a lease agreement for the mineral rights to my property." Morrison took the document, scanning it quickly. "Dated 2 weeks ago. But this says it was signed by—" He frowned. "Margaret Chen. That's impossible. Aunt Margaret died 6 months ago." A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the mine, the scrape of metal against stone. Morrison immediately switched off his flashlight and motioned for Maylene to do the same. They stood in darkness, listening. Another scrape, closer now. Then footsteps. Morrison drew his weapon and whispered directly into Maylene's ear. "Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you go back the way we came and don't stop until you reach the surface." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the yellow glow of another flashlight bouncing off the tunnel walls. Maylene pressed herself against the cold stone, feeling the baby kick restlessly inside her, as if sensing her fear. "I know you're in there," Harold's voice called out, distorted by the echo of the chamber. "Might as well come out. We need to talk." Morrison stepped into the open, his gun trained on the tunnel entrance. "Harold Chen, you're under arrest for the murder of Dr. Sarah Webb." Laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and bitter. Murder? That woman was going to destroy everything. She figured out what this place really is, what it's worth. Couldn't let her ruin it for everyone. Harold stepped into the chamber, his own weapon drawn. He looked haggard, desperate, his clothes dirty and torn, but his eyes held a fierce determination that made Maylene's blood run cold. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," Harold continued, his gaze fixed on Morrison, but his words directed at Maylene. "This isn't just some old gold mine. The geological surveys show deposits worth hundreds of millions. Maybe more. Your aunt knew that. She was going to sell to the highest bidder. So you forged her signature," Morrison said. "Tried to steal the rights." "I tried to save this family's legacy. Do you know what Maylene could do with that kind of money? What it could mean for her child?" Maylene stepped out from behind Morrison, her hand protectively covering her belly. "By killing people? By terrorizing me in my own home?" Harold's expression softened slightly when he saw her. "I never wanted to hurt you, Maylene. Everything I did was for you, for the baby. But Dr. Webb was going to expose everything. She'd figured out the mineral composition, the extent of the deposits. She was going to publish her findings. So you killed her," Morrison said flatly. Harold's grip tightened on his weapon. "I protected what's ours." The basement felt different when Maylene descended the stone steps the next morning. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through everything Marcus had revealed about the Blackwood Society and their century-long obsession with the mine. Jake followed close behind, his flashlight beam dancing across the rough-hewn walls. "Are you sure about this? Maybe we should wait for Detective Chen to get back with those files." "We can't wait," Maylene's voice echoed in the narrow space. "Marcus made it clear. They know I'm here, and they're running out of patience. Whatever's down there, whatever they want so badly, we need to find it first." The tunnel entrance yawned before them, a black mouth that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. Maylene had reinforced the wooden supports yesterday, but the structure still looked precarious. Jake tested the nearest beam with his shoulder, nodding grimly when it held firm. "Ladies first," he said, but his tone was strained. "Though I vote we reconsider this whole plan." Maylene squeezed through the opening, her pregnancy making the passage tighter than it had been weeks ago. The baby kicked against her ribs as if sensing her anxiety. She pressed deeper into the tunnel, following the path she and Dr. Reeves had mapped during their first exploration. The air grew colder as they descended. Their footsteps echoed strangely, creating phantom sounds that made them both freeze and listen. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead, a rhythmic percussion that counted off the seconds. "There," Maylene whispered, pointing her light toward the branching passage they'd discovered before. "That's where Dr. Reeves thought the main vein might be." Jake's beam joined hers, illuminating rough tool marks in the stone walls. Someone had worked this tunnel extensively, carving deeper into the mountain than the preliminary survey had suggested. The craftsmanship was impressive. 19th-century miners had built this to last. They followed the passage as it curved to the right, then split again. Maylene chose the left fork instinctively, drawn by a subtle change in the air current. The tunnel walls here showed different markings, not just toolwork, but symbols carved into the stone. Strange geometric patterns that seemed to follow no recognizable pattern. "May." Jake's voice was tight. "Look at this." He'd stopped beside a section of wall where the symbols were particularly dense. At first glance they seemed random, but as Maylene studied them more closely, she began to see a rhythm. Numbers, perhaps, or coordinates. something meant to convey information to someone who knew how to read it. "It's a map," she breathed. "Look, these lines follow the tunnel branches, and these symbols—" She traced one with her finger. "They're marking distances." Jake aimed his light further down the passage. "Then we're going the right way." They pressed on, following the carved directions deeper into the mountain. The tunnel began to widen, opening into natural cavern spaces that the miners had connected with their artificial passages. Strange rock formations created shadows that seemed to move in their flashlight beams. Then Maylene's light caught something that made her gasp. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, but it wasn't the size that took her breath away. It was what filled it. Wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked against the cavern walls. Some looked old, weathered by decades of underground storage. Others appeared newer, their wood still bearing the pale color of recent construction. Jake swept his light across the nearest stack. "What the hell?" Maylene approached one of the older crates, cautiously. The wood was marked with symbols similar to those they'd seen carved in the tunnel walls. She found a loose board and pried it up with her fingers, revealing the contents. Gold coins gleamed in her flashlight beam, not raw ore, but finished currency. Old American eagles, foreign pieces she didn't recognize, and bars of pure metal that felt impossibly heavy when she lifted one. "This isn't just a mine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a storage facility. Someone's been using these tunnels to hide treasure for generations." Jake had opened another crate nearby. This one contained documents sealed in oiled leather packets. He pulled one out carefully, unfolding papers that looked official. Deeds, certificates. What appeared to be banking records dating back decades. "Maylene." His voice was strange. "These aren't just random documents. Look at the names." She moved to his side, scanning the papers by flashlight. The same family names appeared repeatedly: Blackwood, Morrison, Ashford. Names she recognized from the town's founding families. Names that still appeared on businesses and street signs throughout the valley. "They've been using this place to hide their wealth," Jake said. "Probably for tax evasion, maybe worse. No wonder they want you gone. You're sitting on evidence that could destroy half the prominent families in the county." A sound echoed from the tunnel behind them, the scrape of boots on stone. Maylene's blood turned to ice. Someone else was in the mine. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the shadows behind the largest stack of crates. They killed their flashlights just as voices echoed from the tunnel entrance, growing steadily closer. The basement floor felt cold against Maylene's palms as she pressed herself against the stone wall, listening to the footsteps above. Her heart hammered so violently, she feared whoever was upstairs might hear it echoing through the house. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her terror. Marcus crouched beside her, his breathing shallow. Blood from the gash on his forehead had dried into a dark streak down his cheek, making him look like a warrior painted for battle. In his hand he clutched the leather journal they'd found in the mine, the one that contained the truth about the Ashford family's century-old conspiracy. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Maylene held her breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then came the creak of floorboards as the intruder moved toward the back of the house. "They're checking the kitchen," Marcus whispered, his lips barely moving. Maylene nodded, though she wasn't sure who they were anymore. Sheriff Brennan was dead. She'd seen his body in the mine shaft, a bullet wound in his chest, but someone had been watching them, following them, someone who knew about the gold, about the journal, about everything they'd uncovered. The house groaned above them as heavy boots moved across the wooden floors. Multiple sets of footsteps. At least 2 people, maybe 3. Marcus motioned toward the narrow passage that led deeper into the mine. They'd discovered it hours earlier, following the map in the journal. It was their only escape route now, but the thought of going back into those dark tunnels made Maylene's skin crawl. The mine had already claimed too many lives. Another sound from upstairs, the screech of furniture being moved. They were searching methodically, professionally. These weren't random thieves or curious locals. These were people who knew exactly what they were looking for. "We have to go," Marcus breathed against her ear. Now, while they're distracted. Maylene struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her swollen belly. The baby had been active all day, responding to her stress and adrenaline. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of world she was bringing this child into, a world where people killed for secrets buried in the earth, where greed turned neighbors into enemies. They moved carefully through the basement, avoiding the loose stones that might clatter and give away their position. The entrance to the mine shaft was hidden behind a false wall, invisible unless you knew where to look. Maylene's great-uncle had been clever in his concealment, but not clever enough to avoid whatever fate had befallen him in these tunnels. Marcus eased the hidden panel open, wincing as the hinges produced a soft squeak. The smell of stale air and mineral deposits wafted out, along with something else, something that reminded Maylene of copper pennies and decay. The footsteps upstairs had moved to the front rooms now. Heavy thuds suggested they were overturning furniture, growing frustrated in their search. Soon they'd think to check the basement, and then the hunt would begin in earnest. Marcus stepped through the opening first, then helped Maylene navigate the uneven ground. Her pregnancy made her clumsy, but fear gave her focus. Behind them, the panel swung shut with barely a sound. The tunnel stretched ahead into absolute darkness. Marcus had grabbed a flashlight from the basement workbench, but its beam seemed pathetic against the overwhelming black. The walls were rough-hewn stone, carved by hand over a century ago by men desperate for gold. Their desperation had infected this place, leaving an aura of hunger and violence that still lingered in the stale air. The journal mentioned a back entrance, Marcus said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. About half a mile through the main tunnel. Half a mile might as well have been 50 in Maylene's condition, but she nodded anyway. What choice did they have? Behind them lay certain death. She'd seen the cold calculation in Sheriff Brennan's eyes before someone had put a bullet in him. Whoever was hunting them now possessed that same ruthless efficiency. They walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by decades of accumulated dust and debris. The tunnel branched several times, but Marcus consulted the hand-drawn map in the journal and chose their path with confidence. Maylene tried not to think about what would happen if he was wrong, if they became lost in this underground maze. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they reached a wooden support beam that had partially collapsed. Fresh scratch marks in the wood caught Marcus's attention. Someone had been here recently, carving symbols into the timber. "What does it mean?" Maylene asked. Marcus studied the markings with his flashlight. "It's a warning," he said finally. Someone else knew about the conspiracy. Someone tried to expose it. The realization hit them both simultaneously. They weren't the first to uncover the truth about the mine, about the deaths, about the systematic cover-up that had lasted for generations, but they might be the last, unless they could escape these tunnels alive. Above them, muffled by tons of rock and earth, came the distant sound of splintering wood. The flashlight beam trembled in Maylene's grip as she descended the narrow stone steps, each footfall echoing through the suffocating darkness. Behind her, Jake's breathing came in sharp bursts, his own light casting wild shadows on the ancient walls. They had discovered the hidden entrance behind the collapsed section of the mine, and now they were deeper underground than either had ever imagined possible. "How far down does this go?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. Maylene paused, pressing one hand against her swollen belly as the baby shifted restlessly. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the weight of centuries and secrets. "I don't know, but we're close to something. I can feel it." The passage opened into a vast chamber, their flashlight beams barely penetrating the gloom. As they moved forward, the lights caught glints of metal embedded in the walls, not just gold, but something else entirely. Symbols carved deep into the stone and filled with what looked like silver. "Oh my God!" Jake breathed, moving closer to examine the markings. "These aren't mining marks. They're protective wards." Before Maylene could respond, a new sound reached them from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The scrape of metal on stone, deliberate and rhythmic. They both froze, flashlights aimed toward the noise. "You shouldn't have come down here." The voice emerged from the shadows, and Eleanor Caldwell stepped into their circle of light. But this wasn't the frail, elderly woman they thought they knew. Her posture was straight, her eyes sharp and calculating, and in her hands she held an old mining pick that gleamed with recent use. "Eleanor?" Maylene's voice cracked. "What are you doing here?" "What I've been doing for 60 years, child. Protecting this place from people like you." Eleanor's grip tightened on the pick handle. "Your grandmother understood, eventually. She learned to leave well enough alone." Jake stepped protectively in front of Maylene. "Leave what alone? It's just an old mine." Eleanor's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Just a mine? You have no idea what your family disturbed when they first broke through these walls, what they released into the world above." The flashlight beams wavered as Maylene struggled to process the revelation. "Released? What are you talking about?" "The sickness that's plagued this town for generations. The accidents, the deaths." Eleanor began to circle them slowly, her footsteps sure despite the treacherous terrain. "It all started when your great-grandfather found this chamber. He thought he'd discovered the mother lode, but some treasures are meant to stay buried." A low rumble echoed through the chamber, and dust began to rain down from the ceiling. The baby kicked hard against Maylene's ribs, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. "The mine's unstable," Jake said urgently. "We need to get out of here." "No one's leaving." Eleanor's voice turned cold. "I've spent my entire life cleaning up your family's mess. Do you think I'll let you walk away now, knowing what you know?" Maylene's mind raced as pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. "You killed Thomas Whitmore and Deputy Morrison. They found out about this place, didn't they?" Thomas got too curious about the town records, started asking questions about the death rates, the patterns. Morrison was getting close to the truth about the accidents. Eleanor's expression remained eerily calm, "Just like you have." Another rumble shook the chamber, stronger this time. Loose stones clattered down around them, and Jake grabbed Maylene's arm. "The whole place is coming down." "It's supposed to," Eleanor said simply. "I've been placing charges throughout the lower tunnels for weeks. When this chamber collapses, it'll seal everything forever. The way it should have stayed." Horror dawned on Maylene's face. "You're going to bury us alive." "It's the only way to protect the town. The only way to stop the curse your family brought upon us all." Eleanor raised the mining pick, its metal head catching the flashlight beams. "Your grandmother fought me too at first, but in the end she understood the sacrifice that had to be made." The rumbling intensified, and cracks began to appear in the walls around them. Ancient symbols split and crumbled, releasing wisps of something that might have been gas, or might have been something far worse, into the stagnant air. Jake pulled Maylene toward what looked like another passage, deeper in the chamber. "There has to be another way out." "There isn't," Eleanor called after them, her voice carrying an edge of madness. "I've mapped every tunnel, every shaft. This is where it ends, where it was always meant to end." As they stumbled through the darkness, Maylene felt a sharp pain shoot through her abdomen. The stress and exertion were taking their toll, and she could feel her body beginning to betray her when she needed strength most. Behind them, Eleanor's footsteps echoed steadily, patient and relentless as death itself. The chamber shuddered again, and somewhere in the distance, the first of the charges detonated. The mine shaft seemed to breathe around them as they descended deeper into its belly, their flashlight beams dancing across walls that had witnessed decades of secrets. Maylene's hand instinctively moved to her rounded stomach, feeling the baby's restless movement as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Behind her, Detective Morrison's breathing was labored, his wounded shoulder making every step down the narrow wooden ladder a struggle. "How much farther?" Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible over the drip of water somewhere in the darkness below. Maylene paused on a weathered rung, listening. The voices above had grown fainter, but she knew Vincent Carlyle and his men wouldn't give up easily, not when they were this close. to the fortune that had eluded the Carlyle family for 3 generations. "There," she said, pointing her flashlight toward a horizontal passage that branched off from the main shaft. "My great-aunt's journal mentioned a hidden chamber where they stored the richest ore during the war." They moved carefully through the passage, the ceiling so low that Morrison had to duck his head. The air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something metallic that made Maylene's skin crawl. As they rounded a bend, their lights revealed a vast cavern that opened before them like a cathedral carved from living rock. But it wasn't the glittering veins of gold in the walls that made them both freeze in horror. Scattered across the cavern floor were bones, human bones, some still clothed in the rotted remains of 1940s work clothes. Maylene counted at least 6 skeletons, their skulls showing clear evidence of violent trauma. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed, lowering his gun. "How long have they been down here?" Maylene knelt beside the nearest skeleton, her hands shaking as she examined a rusted nameplate still attached to what had once been a work shirt. "Thomas Brennan," she read aloud. "He was one of the miners who supposedly left town when the mine closed." "They didn't leave," Morrison said grimly, understanding flooding his features. "They were murdered." A sound echoed from the passage behind them, footsteps, moving fast. Maylene grabbed Morrison's good arm, pulling him behind a massive boulder that jutted from the cavern wall. They switched off their flashlights just as voices filled the chamber. "Spread out," Carlyle's voice commanded. They can't have gone far. 3 beams of light swept the cavern, and Maylene heard one of Carlyle's men curse as he discovered the scattered bones. "Sir, you need to see this." Carlyle's footsteps approached, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a cold satisfaction that chilled Maylene to the bone. "Well, well, the old bastard's handiwork. My grandfather always was thorough when it came to protecting family interests." "What do we do about the bodies?" another voice asked. Maylene pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. They had killed others, recently. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her terror, and she fought back a cry of pain. Morrison's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of comfort and determination. She could feel him tensing beside her, preparing for what they both knew was inevitable. "Check every passage," Carlyle ordered. "They're hiding somewhere in this maze, and I want them found. The pregnant one especially. She's the key to everything. As long as she's alive, she owns this land legally. Dead, it reverts to the county, and I can buy it through intermediaries." The footsteps separated, heading toward different tunnels that branched off from the main cavern. Maylene realized with growing dread that they were trapped. The passage they had used to enter was now blocked by Carlyle's men, and she had no idea where the other tunnels led. Morrison leaned close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "There's another way out," he whispered so quietly she almost couldn't hear him. "Your great-aunt's journal, didn't it mention a connection to the old Brennan property?" Maylene nodded, remembering the cryptic reference to the neighbor's secret. If Thomas Brennan had been killed to protect the mine's secrets, perhaps his property held answers. A beam of light swept dangerously close to their hiding spot, and they pressed themselves deeper into the shadows. The baby seemed to sense the danger, its movements becoming more agitated with each passing moment. "Time to move," Morrison mouthed, gesturing toward a narrow crevice in the cavern wall that their flashlights had revealed earlier. As Carlyle's men continued their methodical search, Maylene and Morrison began their desperate crawl toward what they hoped would be salvation, leaving behind the bone-scattered evidence of a family's murderous legacy and racing against time to prevent their own names from being added to the mine's deadly roll call. The morning sun cast long shadows across the police tape that still fluttered around Maylene's property, but Detective Morrison had finally given them clearance to return. Maylene stood at the threshold of the stone house, one hand resting on her rounded belly where the baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her tension. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, his arm protective around her shoulders. She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I need to see it through." The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if Vincent Harrow's death had lifted a weight that had pressed down on these walls for decades. The morning light streaming through the windows revealed dust motes dancing peacefully where just days ago violence had erupted. They made their way to the basement entrance, where the hidden door still hung open. The smell of earth and metal rose from below, no longer ominous but simply ancient. Maylene had made her decision during the long nights at the hospital, and now she was ready to act on it. The mining equipment sat silent in the tunnels, the excavated gold still scattered where Harrow had left it in his desperate final hours. Morrison had explained that legally everything beneath the house belonged to Maylene. The gold, the mine, all of it. She was suddenly wealthy beyond imagination, but the weight of that knowledge sat heavy on her conscience. "The town deserves to know," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the tunnels. "All these years, people have struggled here while this fortune sat hidden." Jake squeezed her hand. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about Mrs. Chen at the grocery store, working 16-hour days, about the families who've lost their farms, about the young people who leave because there's nothing here for them." She paused, feeling the baby kick as if in agreement. "This gold isn't just mine. It belongs to this place, to these people." They climbed back to the main floor, where Maylene had already arranged to meet with 3 visitors. The first to arrive was Mayor Patricia Valdez, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd been fighting to keep the town alive for years. Behind her came Dr. Sarah Kim from the Regional Historical Society, and finally, James Patterson, the mining engineer Morrison had recommended. "Thank you all for coming," Maylene began as they gathered in the living room she'd spent weeks renovating. "I wanted to discuss the future of what we've found here." Patterson had already provided his preliminary assessment. The mine contained enough gold to be worth approximately $12 million, possibly more with proper extraction. It was a staggering sum that could transform not just Maylene's life, but the entire community. "I want to establish a foundation," Maylene announced. "The Blackwood Heritage Foundation. It will oversee the responsible extraction of the gold and use the proceeds to benefit the town. Education, healthcare, small business loans, infrastructure improvements." Mayor Valdez's eyes widened. "You're talking about donating $12 million? "I'm talking about investing it where it belongs," Maylene corrected. "This house, this mine, they're part of this town's history. The foundation will preserve that history while building a future." Dr. Kim leaned forward eagerly. "We could create a proper museum, document the indigenous heritage of the mining techniques we found down there. The archaeological value alone is immense." "And we could do it right this time," Patterson added. "Environmentally sound extraction, proper safety measures, create jobs for local people, train them in modern mining techniques." As the discussion continued, Maylene felt a deep sense of rightness settling over her. This was what her great-aunt Eleanor would have wanted, she was certain. The old woman had lived her entire life in this house, part of this community. She wouldn't have wanted the treasure to benefit only one person. Jake caught her eye and smiled. They'd talked late into the night about their own future. They would keep the house, raise their child here, but they would live simply on a modest portion of the gold's value. The rest would serve the greater good. "There is one condition," Maylene said as the meeting wound down. "I want the foundation to also establish a scholarship program for young mothers. Education, vocational training, whatever they need to build independent lives." She thought of herself just months ago, pregnant, alone, with nowhere to turn. How different her life might have been if she'd had support, opportunity, hope. As the visitors left, making plans and promises, Maylene walked out to the front porch where she'd first stood all those weeks ago. The view was the same, rolling hills, ancient trees, the peaceful isolation that had first called to her heart. But everything else had changed. Jake joined her, pulling her close as the baby moved between them. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Maylene smiled, watching the afternoon light paint the hills gold. "None at all. We have everything we need right here." In the distance, she could hear the town stirring with new possibility, and she knew Eleanor would have been proud.